This video is for the Pennsylvania Keystone, and it is a review of Anchor 4, Homeostasis and Transport. In this anchor, the goal is to identify and describe the cell structures involved with transport of materials into, out of, throughout the cell, and explain the mechanisms that permit organisms to maintain biological balance. So that's where we get into a lot of homeostasis, not just at the cellular level, but even at the system level. This organelle is a Golgi apparatus. You know that because of the folded membranes that are stacked on top of each other. The Golgi apparatus helps to modify and package proteins that are going to be exported from the cell. They're packaged into what are called vesicles. This is a mitochondria. You know that because of the folded membrane on the inside of the mitochondria. This is the powerhouse of the cell where respiration is going to take place. Aerobic respiration requires oxygen and sugar. The result is lots of ATP and some water as a waste product. This is the rough ER. It consists of endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes. Remember that ribosomes are the site of protein synthesis. So rough ER is going to help make the proteins. Then the Golgi apparatus is going to help modify and package the proteins. Here we have lysosomes. You know they're lysosomes because there's digestive enzymes inside of that vesicle. And then we have vacuoles or vesicles. A lot of times they're very similar. Vacuoles are organelles that store things like food and water, whereas vesicles are going to be organelles that transport things. Here's a great example of a vacuole, a large storage area in a cell. Here's an example of a chloroplast. So this lets me know that I'm looking at a plant cell. Chloroplasts are going to photosynthesize sunlight and make some energy. Here we have the cell wall, which is unique to plant cells. Whereas animal cells only have a plasma membrane, plant cells also have a cell wall. Here are some common eukaryotic cell organelles. The nucleus, for example, the control center of the cell, endoplasmic reticulum, which transports things throughout the cell, the Golgi apparatus, which helps to package and modify proteins, mitochondria, which help to give the cell energy, especially aerobic energy. The centrosome, which helps in cell division, is made of microtubules. The lysosomes, which helps to recycle old worn out cell parts, and digestion, because it's held and filled with digestive enzymes. And ribosomes, which are RNA, ribosomal RNA, and that is the site of protein synthesis, where and how proteins get made. 3 things to remember about a plasma membrane. That is the outside membrane of the cell. One is that it's a fluid mosaic. That simply means the plasma membrane is made of a lot of different parts, proteins, carbohydrates, fats. And those large structures don't stay in the same location. They move around through the plasma membrane, kind of like ducks in a duck pond game. Selectively permeable means that some things can enter that cell, but other things cannot. Some things can diffuse through the cell membrane, but other things can't. Some things can go through the channel proteins, but other things cannot. That reminds us of a tea bag where water can go into and out of the tea bag, and so can the flavor of the tea, but the tea leaves cannot diffuse through that membrane. Lipid bilayer tells us that there's 2 major layers of lipids. There's the phosphate across the top, and then the 2 prongs of the phospholipids, the lipid part, poking into the cell membrane like this. And that reminds us of a double-stuffed Oreo cookie. It has to be double-stuffed because the phosphates are like the cookie part, and then the 2 layers of the creamy filling are the lipid parts inside of that cell membrane. Diffusion simply means the movement of particles from an area where there is a high concentration to an area where there's a low concentration. So it's an area where there's a lot to an area where there is a little. Osmosis is simply the diffusion of water. If a cell is in a solution where the water is diffusing into the cell, that is a hypotonic solution. That is, the solution has less solute than the cell. So water is going from an area where there is a lot to an area where there's a little. So it's going from the solution into the cell, causing the cell to swell up like an O, hypotonic. The cell swells up like an O. If the cell is in a solution that is hypertonic, that means that there's more solute in the solution than there is in the cell. So the water is going from an area where there's a high concentration of water, the cell, to an area where there's a low concentration of water outside the cell. So the cell starts to shrivel up, hypertonic, like seawater or very salty water. Hypotonic would be like pure water. So right in the middle is isotonic. Isotonic just means the amount of solute in the cell is equal to what's outside of the cell. Like saline solution would be isotonic to your eyes. So you use saline solution for things like contacts and IVs. There are three major types of transport: diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active transport across the cell membrane. Diffusion and facilitated diffusion require no energy, so that's considered passive transport. Active transport does require energy, so it's considered active. Diffusion simply means we're going from an area where there is a high concentration to an area of low concentration, and through that cell membrane, certain things can diffuse. Small molecules can diffuse. Nonpolar molecules can diffuse. Some molecules need the help of a channel protein, a protein that will allow them to pass through the cell membrane. Polar molecules need a channel protein. Sometimes larger molecules need a channel protein. So things like sugar and water are diffused through facilitated diffusion. You might wonder, why is water diffused through facilitated diffusion? Well, remember, this is a lipid bilayer membrane, and oils and waters don't mix. So that hydrophobic part of the lipid bilayer is repelling the water. So a channel protein called an aquaporin helps water diffuse through facilitated diffusion. Active transport requires energy. This energy comes from cellular respiration. That's where we get ATP. So the mitochondria is creating that ATP from glucose, and then that ATP is in part going to be used to help pump material from an area where it's in low concentration through the cell membrane to an area of high concentration. Or sometimes it's pumped out of the cell that way. Homeostasis just means keeping the internal environment stable. Sometimes that means the internal environment of the cell. And so the cell membrane acts to do just that. Sometimes it means the internal environment of the organism, in which case we have some factor that is out of control. Inside the cell, it might be too salty, too much carbon dioxide, something like that. Inside the human body, it might be that the pH is low or the temperature is high. Either way, that change is detected by a receptor, typically a nerve ending, and that message is sent to a control center. Normally that's the brain, not always, but normally the brain. The brain then sends a message to an effector. Effectors are muscles or glands that are going to restore the internal environment. So for example, your body temperature rises, that's detected by a thermoreceptor. The message is sent to the hypothalamus of your brain. Your brain then, the hypothalamus, sends a message to your sweat glands, and your sweat glands start producing sweat. Notice here that we have nutrients flowing through the bloodstream. After you digest food, those nutrients are taken to your bloodstream and they're distributed around your body. But how? They simply diffuse from the capillaries into the cells. So there's a high concentration of nutrients in the bloodstream, a low concentration in the cells. The nutrients then diffuse across those membranes. Waste products like carbon dioxide or waste products from the digestion then are in high concentration in the cell, and they diffuse out of the cell. This is why cell size is so important. If cells are too large, that process of diffusion takes too long, and those waste products can't get out, and those nutrients can't get into the parts of the cell that need them. Now, why is this blood flow important? Well, if the blood continues to flow in this direction, it's constantly carrying nutrients past the cell. So there's always a high concentration of nutrients in the bloodstream moving into that cell. And so long as the blood flow is moving in that direction, it's always carrying waste products away from the cell, which means there's a low concentration of waste products in the blood vessel, and it can carry those waste products away from the cell. That's important because if that cell dies because it's not getting nutrients or the waste is building up, then the tissue dies. If the tissue dies, that might lead to organ failure. If the organs fail, then the body system might fail. And if the system fails, then the organism fails. Here's another example of diffusion, but in this case, it has to do with the lungs, let's say. So now we're diffusing carbon dioxide from the bloodstream into the lungs, because in the bloodstream it's in high concentration, the lungs is low concentration, so it's moving into the lungs. The lungs, every time you take a breath, that oxygen rushes into the lungs, and then there's a high concentration of oxygen that diffuses into your bloodstream. So diffusion is pretty common in several body systems. For example, your lungs, your circulatory system, even with your kidneys. Your kidneys are constantly diffusing waste products out of your body and trying to keep things that your body can still use. I hope that helps you understand a little better the importance of diffusion, osmosis, and homeostasis in body systems.